he is a wise grazing scientist, practitioner who's been in this space for a long time. And in a little bit of tiny trivia that's otherwise irrelevant, the primary reason I'm here today is because in 2014, Fred got a little sick, and I stepped in to fill in for him on a talk. And they asked me to hang around and get involved with the Grass-Fed Exchange, and they've been my best friends ever since. So Fred is a professor emeritus at Utah State University, and as I'm sure he'll tell you, his original scientific work was studying how animals graze and medicate themselves and learn. And from that, Fred has extracted wisdom and knowledge about how we can learn to be nourished, and that I'm just going to say it's a big we in this. So without further ado and no elaboration, I invite you to give a little applause as Fred Provenza comes up here and talks about nourishment.
Well, thank you very much, Russ. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with all of you folks. No question about it. I think back over many years now. I must have come to maybe the first one and several since then. I was able to work my way out of one of them. Had to have abdominal surgery to do it. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you folks for certain. And I guess if there's nothing else that I would say in this presentation, it's just a deep appreciation for what you do, for the things that you're trying to do, and for the kind of things that Deborah was talking about and Mary. And I'm going to link back with what they talked about and then try to link forward to touch on probably where Nicole's going throughout my presentation here today. So, rediscovering the wisdom of the body. Rediscovering, I guess, implies that we're trying to find something that we had at one time and that was lost because the world changes and doesn't always change in ways that we maybe think that it should. So I want to start out on this topic of change, and I'm going to start there and I'm going to end there on this notion that really the only constant in life is change. The world is constantly changing, yet we typically regard change as anomalous, a kind of transitory disruption in a normally constant world. Even Albert Einstein was reluctant to accept change. When he introduced the cosmological constant into the general theory of relativity, what that amounted to was a refusal to accept change as the guiding principle structuring the evolution of the universe. And it was, as he later recounted, the greatest blunder he ever made in his career. On a local scale here on Earth, fires, floods, droughts, hurricanes, when great volcanoes like Mount St. Helens erupts, knocking down trees, covering the earth with a layer of volcanic ash for miles around, we think how strange it is that nature should misbehave so. It is, we tell ourselves, a momentary lapse, a kind of geological tantrum. Soon our old planet will regain its composure, its sameness. But the truth is, it's only our short tenure on Earth that deludes us. Our time here is far too short to see continents crash together and tear apart, mountains rise and fall, oceans become deserts, climates warming and cooling endlessly, plant and animal species coming and going like the ever-changing colors and shapes of a kaleidoscope. Change then isn't the exception to the rule, it's the only rule. Any individual, any organization, any species, if it's going to survive, has got to be able to cope with change. So how well do they do? The average lifetime of an S&P 500 company shrunk from 61 years in 1958 to 18 years today. And at that rate that's going, 75% of the companies around today will be extinct in 5 years, replaced by other companies. Civilizations do a little better. They typically last 250 years or 10 generations as they evolve through 5 different stages, beginning with pioneers characterized by enterprise, shared values, and shared vision. That eventually devolves in the later stages into civilizations that are extremely divisive, polarized, lack any sort of shared values and shared visions, and that occurs at a time when the civilization more than ever needs to rise to huge, wicked challenges ecologically, economically, socially, and politically. But the civilization, unable to transcend the bounds that people in the civilization have created, falls under its own weight. Species do a little better. They typically last 1 million to several million years, but even they eventually succumb to the same plights of companies and civilizations. We're told by paleontologists that 99% of the species that have ever been here on this planet are now extinct. Our species, we're told by anthropologists, has been around in its current form for roughly 300,000 years. During the last 15,000 years, we transformed from what we were formerly hunters and gatherers into a species that started to take on farming. As we've gone during the last century or so, and Mary Berry talked at length about that, we've really made a move toward industrial agriculture. And some anthropologists claim that's the biggest mistake our species ever made in terms of our trajectory toward extinction. One of the primary reasons, and Mary touched on that nicely today, is we move from ecological kind of economies to economies that are fossil fuel driven. And I want to talk about and elaborate just a bit on that, especially focusing on this idea of plant diversity. And plants are the givers of life, right? They provide life for everything above and below ground, and they're linked with all those things there that are in this slide. So I often like to say that plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for all life on Earth, below ground and above ground. And scientists have been studying and learning a great deal about this. Where I got involved during the last 50 years was with plant ecologists who are studying all the ways that plants communicate, and it's a biochemical, phytochemical language that they communicate in, that they interact in. And so these, what are formerly called secondary compounds, are vital to that language. They serve so many different roles that people have come to discover in terms of helping plants survive in the environment, drought, defense, sunscreen, competition with other plants, this notion of allelopathy. They also provide nourishment and attraction for other creatures, as well as providing health for all kinds of creatures in the system. So we've come to appreciate through these studies the many, many fundamentally important roles that these formerly called secondary compounds are playing. Well, what's interesting is that while some people were learning about the value of plants and the roles that these secondary compounds play, others were reducing their concentrations to increase the yields of plants. There's a cost to the plant to producing these compounds. If you get rid of those compounds, you can increase yield. And so we're trying to increase yields, we're maximizing energy and protein content in plants. But what that did that people weren't realizing is it made plants more susceptible to environmental hazards. That's the reasons plants had evolved all these compounds. Well, in their stead, we've come to rely on fossil fuel-based pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers to grow and protect plants in monocultures. We've also come to rely on antibiotics and anthelmintics to treat diseases and parasites in livestock. You know, when they have access to diverse mixtures of different plant species, wild animals, and as we showed in many of our studies, domestic animals as well, can learn to self-medicate for a whole variety of different kind of illnesses. So where that's led us, and the bottom line in my view, is that nowadays to produce 1 calorie of food requires 2 calories of fossil fuels for machineries, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, on and on and on. we use another 8 to 10 calories to process, package, deliver, store, and cook modern food. Now, if you think about that, imagine that you're a wild plant or a wild animal. Can you even come close to affording to exert 14 calories of energy to gain 1 calorie? There's no way, right? You don't survive, and neither can we. We're not going to be able to continue to do that kind of business. So this seeming catastrophe, in my mind, is creating wonderful opportunities, and that's what the role that you're playing, in my mind, that all of you folks are playing, is moving away from ecological kind of approaches toward agriculture back toward ecological approaches that see us as a part of nature and natural communities, and thinking about how to use nature as a model for how to produce. So this notion of change, then, to me is fundamental in terms of how I've thought about systems over the years. So how then, if we take this idea of change and relate it to what Russ had asked me to talk about, this idea of nourishing the body and how do animals nourish themselves, well, in an ever-changing world, how does that work, basically? And to put some context on this, if you think about it, nobody has to tell a wild creature how to eat, develop, and replicate. They know how to do that, they're very good at doing that. Livestock, as we showed over the years, herbivores, cattle, sheep, and goats, are challenged to select diets from a mixture of different plant species. Some are nutritious, some are toxic, depending on the site where the plant's growing. It may something that's nutritious on one site may be toxic on another site. Morning's different from afternoon, seasonally. And what I'm trying to say is there's tremendous challenges out there in knowing what to select, and domestic animals that are locally adapted to the environments they inhabit do a great job at meeting their needs. So how do animals do that? How do animals do that without having nutritionists, pharmacists, veterinarians, and so forth as a part of the game? Is the question that we really focused on over the years in the work that I was doing. And there are three legs, I would say, to that stool. One are these metabolically mediated flavor feedback relationships that I'll talk a little bit more about that here directly. The second is this social cultural part. So you've got the individual part, the metabolically mediated relationships, but without a proper social culture, that doesn't work. The third leg to that stool is the availability of wholesome food. So all three of those become integral then in terms of the wisdom of the body being manifest. And I'm going to elaborate on that as I go through. If I were to ask you why you like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me you like it because it tastes good, right? And if I were to ask you why you don't like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me you don't like it because it tastes bad, like this little guy here in the slide. And you'd be in good company, but what I want you to think about is that palatability is more than a matter of taste. Liking for food involves feedback, and that feedback is coming from cells and organ systems, and it's in response to energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and then this whole array of these different secondary compounds, phenolics, terpenes, alkaloids, and so forth. So feedback changes liking for the flavor of a food as a function of need, and it's not something we sit and think about any more than any of you are thinking about which enzymes to release to digest whatever snack you had there at the break, right? We don't do that, and this feedback is happening that same way in a non-cognitive level. Now, what I'm going to do is show you a short video segment here to try to make this come alive. We did this over and over and over again with animals, where we would put them in a particular nutritional state, and then we would see if they would select a food or a medicine that was appropriate to rectify that state. What you're going to see in this video is two groups of lambs. They're eating straw, and one group loves the straw. They love it because after they ate the straw, we drenched them with a mineral that they were lacking. They were a little bit deficient, not vastly, just a little bit deficient. We drench them, and now you'll see the change in liking for the food as a function of that. So the one group absolutely loves the straw, right? The other group can't figure out what the heck's going on. And it's simply as what we've done is change their liking as a function of the nutrients that we infused into their gut after they ate the straw. Does that make sense? So we separated the flavor from the feedback. So some of the first studies we did were with energy, and I love this quote of Dave Barry. He says, what are calories? He says, calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, provided we have by Mother Nature, so we have a way to get onion dip into our mouths at parties, has none. If you add the feedback part to that, that's what's happening with this whole deal. And so I'm going to make a long story very short here and just say we did hundreds of studies with cattle, with sheep, with goats, with birds, looking at primary compounds, secondary compounds, and what I can say is feedback alters liking for all those different things over and over and over again. It's changing liking. And the more adequate the feedback is relative to the need, the higher the liking is. And it moves away from individual foods. It's combinations of foods that really matter. Nothing occurs in a vacuum. And so it gets complex. It's higher order interactions amongst these compounds, but it's feedback that's driving the liking. So to sum up then, what I'm trying to say then is these flavor feedback interactions involve phytochemicals interacting with cells and organ systems, including the microbiome. Nowadays, humans are really talking a lot about the microbiome, and what are they saying? The microbiome is changing our liking for food, right? We're eating to meet their needs. What I'm saying is it's not just the microbiome, it's every organ system in the body. And so these relationships then are mediated by nerves, neurotransmitters, peptides, hormones, a whole bunch of stuff we don't need to get into. But that becomes the basis. That's how cells talk to the palate. I think one of the most interesting books that I read related to this was by Claire Sylvia, and it's titled A Change of Heart. And it makes this come alive. Claire was one of the first people to get organ transplants. She had heart and lungs from a young man. And reading her account, it lets you realize that when you put what you would think are just these benign organs from another person into your body, it totally changes who you are. She was a 40-year-old woman that got heart and lungs from a 20-year-old man. And when you make that kind of a switch, there's a lot of changes take place in the way that you experiencing the world, right? And the one I want to point out here is that her liking for food broadened out. Foods that she formerly disliked totally. For instance, she was on the exercise bike just before she was released from the hospital. It was one of the first times, so the press was there talking with her. And they said, if you could have anything you want right now, what would you like? She said, actually, I'd like a beer. And she said, the minute I said that, I wished I could take the words back for two reasons. One, it was a flippant response to a serious question. Two, I don't even like beer. So all these foods she hadn't liked before, she came to really like a lot. Do you get what I'm trying to say? Is these organ systems aren't benign. They're conscious. They're conscious. They're interacting. They become who whatever you call you is. They become a fundamental part of that. And that book really makes all of that come alive. And these experiences then start in the womb. They start in the womb and early in life of where we start to develop our preferences. It becomes that link to place, the molecules of emotion that link us to place, as Mary was talking about. And that's in a wide range of creatures, everything from earthworms to birds to creatures in the ocean, you name it. This fidelity for foods and for places and early life. It's the home field advantage in life, knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. And those links that we get to the places, many of us, where we're born and raised, that's that being manifest. That's where, when we started our work 45 years ago, looking at experiences early in life with cattle, sheep, and goats, we had no trouble to show what strong preferences they formed for different foods as a result of what mother was eating. And it started in the womb. The fetal taste system's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So flavors of foods that mom's eating is getting into the amniotic fluid. It's starting to influence, this is food. The young creature is learning this is food. After birth, flavors get into mother's milk. This is food. Then mother is a model, not only for food, but where to go as well. So it's no, these kind of linkages are fundamental. They also change, these experiences early in life influence form, function, and behavior. They change organ systems, the preferences I was just talking about with Claire Sylvia, those kind of changes. And now this whole field of epigenetics is revealing how gene expression changes as a function of these experiences. Well, the very same thing is happening in humans, and there's a very rich literature about that to show that what mother does in utero early in life and then experiences early in life are fundamental to our preferences. Probably the most elaborate studies ever done, and I think some of the most interesting studies, were done nearly 100 years ago by Clara Davis. She, I don't know, I would have loved to have met this lady actually, but she decided that she wanted to study how experiences early on influence preferences in humans, and she wanted to see if humans have this wisdom, if there's a wisdom to the body to enable them to know what to do. So she got 15 children given up for adoption. She ran the study for 6 years. Imagine this, 6 years, every meal recording what those 15, yeah, that's right, that's what I think too. Recording what those children ate. It's phenomenal data set. And those foods, I don't know if you can read them, there's 34 foods that were available seasonally. Key point, they're wholesome foods. They're not junk foods. It's not ultra-processed food. Wholesome foods available to them. Here's the point she made. She said, there was no indication that children innately knew what to eat. They had to learn. They were figuring it out. Each child did that in its own way. She said no two children ever selected the same combination of foods as they went along. No child ever selected the same foods from meal to meal. But every child selected a meal that met their needs. There were pediatricians that were studying those children. They said they'd never seen a healthier set of children. So Clara concludes that the children, Clara became the culture for those children, right? She was the culture, and she said that's where we need cultures that know about those things, and that's where that knowledge should reside. It should be left to the wisdom of the culture to do that. Unfortunately, since those days, that hasn't been the case during the past century. The choices people learn to make now are influenced by corporate, political, and academic elders, and they don't, as Mary emphasized over and over again, don't necessarily have your interests in mind, or mind either. So now we have ultra-processed foods have created a pandemic of obesity and diet-related diseases, whose symptoms then the medical and pharmaceutical industries treat at enormous expense. It's a vicious cycle. There's a book that's coming out next month, and one of the chapters in it is titled Follow the Money. It's titled The Great Plant-Based Con. Jane Buxton wrote it. It's when you start to follow, and we all know this, right? We know this, but when you're rereading that chapter, it's just amazing to see all the money to be made off of the poor health of people, basically. And now it's to the extent that children even at birth, have transgenerational metabolic syndrome. So not a good situation, right? So let's talk then a bit about, well, how might we think about, how could we get back to something that's more wholesome, right? If it's possible at all. And I often think, how can we create meals that nourish and satiate? You know, when you're eating wholesome foods and really appropriate combinations of foods, you don't have to eat a lot to be satisfied. It's the combinations are good. And I think now, back to my roots in Colorado, growing up in the mountains there, and I think of the old people, the grandparents and the great-grandparents. They all grew huge gardens, and they were proud of those gardens. It was amazing how good they were. You'd look at those gardens, you knew it was health. They all had chickens. They got eggs and they butchered the chickens. Many of them had a hog that they raised. In other words, they brought those traditions with them when they came over from Europe. And when they cooked foods, the meals, they were cooked from scratch, and they were absolutely delicious. They grew their own herbs, had their own spices. So the combinations of foods that they put together for meals nourished and satiated. When I look to my parents' generation and then to my generation and beyond that, all that went away. People quit growing gardens, quit making foods from scratch, wholesome meals from scratch, and so forth, and that's contributed. So how can we work our way back? To add to that, all that's gone on, I think Mark Shaxter does an excellent job in the Dorito effect of talking about this. The flavors of wholesome foods have become, during my lifetime, the flavors of wholesome foods have become blander at the same time that ultra-processed foods have become irresistible. And Mark gets into all that the food industry has done to create that kind of situation. But the bottom line is we've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, and we've incentivized all the fake foods. People have looked in and studied what's gone on with this, and you're probably well aware of it, but it's well known that the phytochemical richness has declined from 10 to 50% in fruits, vegetables, and grains during the last 50 years or so. There's 3 reasons for that: the varieties we grow, the ways that we grow them, and then picking them green and shipping them. We're just talking on the way out today. Plants lose a huge amount of nutrient content simply being picked green and in shipment. So foods look great, but they have no flavor. And that lack of flavor is a reflection of the fact that they have no phytochemical richness, right? The body is telling us that there's nothing going on here. Flavor and phytochemical richness depend then on the variety of the plant, the nature of the soil, and the growing conditions. Several years ago, back in 1981, I was asked to go to Mexico and give some talks, and then we toured around the countryside. And the tour was the most interesting ever for me in terms of foods. You know, I'd always liked, quote, Mexican food, and I've always thought of it as hot, you know, and I thought, boy, when I go to Mexico, I'm going to get a lot of hot Mexican food. It wasn't hot at all, but what was amazing was the richness of flavors. The varieties they were growing and the combinations of foods were just out of this world. I had never had such a gustatory kind of experience, honestly. And I remember the tortillas down there. When I got back to the States, I searched for a year to try to find tortillas that tasted that good. I never have found it. But what that was saying was that the varieties they were growing and the ways that they were growing was creating this incredible richness, right? There's a corn that Sue and I have liked to grow. We've grown gardens for the 50 years we've been together. It's called bodacious. And in the conditions that we grew it in Cache Valley when we were in Utah, it was an incredibly flavorful corn. Well, last summer, I finally got some to grow in our garden. We got some nice ears of corn, but field corn tasted better than that bodacious. So what it's reflecting, right, is it's not only the variety, it's the conditions under which those plants are being grown. All of those things influence then the flavor and phytochemical richness. Well, people are learning nowadays, and I just read a review by David Montgomery that farms that combine no-till cover crops and diverse combinations of crops and so forth are higher in minerals and vitamins and phytochemicals. People are coming to really appreciate that, and a lot's being done in that regard. I also recently came across a paper published late last year that emphasizes this point and emphasizes for people who are growing livestock on pasture the value of plant diversity. This was done in Minnesota, and they showed after 23 years, plots with 16 perennial plant species had much more hugely increased nutrient kind of density in those plants. They also had much more soil, water, and nutrient-holding carbon in them than ones that were grown in monoculture. So diversity matters in huge ways. Nutrient inputs from living roots are 2 to 3 times more efficient than litter inputs in forming both fast-cycling particulate organic carbon as well as the slow-cycling mineral-associated organic carbon. And that's what they're showing in these studies and the value of diversity in that regard. If you think about it, each plant species has a unique rhizosphere community. And diverse mixtures of species then enhance the microbiomes of every creature, from the creatures below ground to the creatures above ground as well. Fundamentally important. So it's little wonder then that researchers nowadays are showing that health improves when livestock graze diverse mixtures of plants compared to when they're grazing monocultures. They can gain weight more efficiently with less emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, and they can reach slaughter weight nearly as quickly as animals in feedlots when they're given diverse mixtures of plants. Obviously, the kind of plants that are in those mixtures and the functional diversity becomes very important. What I want to do next is to talk about then link plant diversity and chemistry with the biochemical richness of the diet of animals and with the quality of milk, meat, and cheese. We have a lot of work that's going along those lines. And I want to set the stage with, life in the Rocky Mountains. Angus Ferris was in this book that was written back in the 1800s, he was talking about bison. He was talking about bison in good condition. He said when they got in good condition, there was no food that was better than that. He said, with it, we require no seasoning whatsoever. Think about that. No seasoning. We boil, roast, or fry it as we please and live upon it solely without bread or vegetables of any kind. And he goes on to say, what seems most strange about the whole deal is that they never get tired of eating it. In other words, that meat is really meeting needs at fundamental levels. So how is that happening? That's the question that we're really interested in. And we're comparing meat of animals from feedlots with meat from animals eating phytochemically rich diets. Stefan von Vliet, Stefan, raise your hand. I want you to know he's the lead guy on this. I'm a cheerleader. He's working with many, many people. But there's tremendous interest in trying to look at this. And we're doing 3 kinds of work. One is what's referred to as metabolomics analyses. It's a way to look beyond omega-3 and CLA and that to get a really broad view of the thousands of different compounds that are in meats, as well as the phytochemical and biochemical richness of the meat. We're also going to be entering into feeding trials with people to look at how they respond when you eat meat from animals that come through a feedlot versus meat from animals that are eating a rich array of different plant species. Hardly any work's been done on that. And lastly, and Stefan's done some neat work on this, going to be looking at clinical trials that look more broadly at health, including satiety. I have people that swear up and down to me that they can tell the difference between meat that comes from a place where there's a diverse array of plant species in the diet. They say not only is the flavor better, but it satiates much more rapidly. They don't need to eat nearly as much of that meat to meet their needs. So we're interested in those kind of things. Let me give you an example of work we're doing with bison. And in this particular study, and it's important to point out, we had animals that were finished in pens, but in those pens, they weren't just on a total mixed ration. They had a choice of corn, of meadow hay and of alfalfa hay. And then we compared that with animals that were finished on rangelands. And we found tremendous, tremendous differences, even with the animals given a choice in the pens. The animals on the rangelands have meat that's much more phytochemically rich. It's higher in antioxidants, higher in anti-inflammatory compounds, and less oxidative stress is being expressed. Bison finished in pens also show early signs of metabolic syndrome. Stefan's done a lot of work on that on humans, and he says the tissue of animals from the pens is much more like a human that has pre-metabolic syndrome. The ones from animals out there on the rangeland are much more like an athlete. And we attribute that to two things. One is diet, and the second is exercise, right? The ones out there on rangelands are able to move about much more, so they're a healthier creature. I also mentioned that we're going to be looking at inflammation. You may or may not know that anytime we eat a meal, there's an inflammatory response that occurs in our body. The degree to which that occurs depends upon the combinations of foods that we're eating. Notably, low-grade systemic inflammation leads to various kinds of diseases, and so moderating inflammation by eating wholesome foods can prevent or even treat disease. So if the meats that we're eating are also influencing that, that's important to know. And I know of one study that's been done on the globe that looks at that. And it was a study that was done in Australia, and what they did was compare inflammation for people that ate kangaroo, that had been foraging out on rangelands in Australia, versus cattle that came through feedlots on total mixed rations. And there was a huge difference in inflammatory response between the two. The people eating the kangaroo, hardly any inflammatory response. Those eating the meat from feedlot, very rapid rise in inflammatory markers and stayed high for a long period. That needs to be explored, and I'm happy that Stefan's going to be exploring that under a number of conditions. In cases where you're not comparing kangaroos with cattle, you're comparing cattle with cattle, bison with bison, sheep with sheep, and so forth and so on. So to conclude this part of the presentation, I'll go back to where I started. How do we create wholesome foods? And I think 75 years ago, Aldo Leopold had it right when he said there's two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of thinking that food comes from the grocer. The other is the danger of thinking that heat comes from the furnace. He said to avoid the first danger, one should plant a garden, preferably where there's no grocer to confuse the issue. To avoid the second, you cut a good oak and lay it on the andirons and let it warm your shins during a blizzard. What he's talking about is getting back in touch with our roots, with what we all come from, whether we're rural or urban or wherever. And I often think most people don't own farms. They don't own ranches. But many people have yards. They have lawns, right? And I think, why can't we turn those from monocultures of Kentucky bluegrass or whatever it is in your part of the country into vegetable, herbal, medicinal kind of gardens? Why can't we grow a few chickens? Why can't we have a hog around? I know there's a million reasons why, but to me, that's what makes sense where we are as a society nowadays, to get grounded and rooted in those kind of things. This is the head gardener at our place in Innis, and we're living on a rock pile, so we've created deep beds to grow vegetable, herbal, medicinal gardens. We've also, more than anything, we've allowed the native plant species, rather than to put all this water that's becoming very, very rare nowadays, we simply let the native species, and it boggles my mind. The first thing people do when they move into this little place in Innis and get in their house is they plow under all the native plant species. And it's like, how do we transform the consciousness to appreciate the beauty? When you're on our little place, I shouldn't have... You know, right now there's phlox growing everywhere. There's larkspur that's getting ready to bloom. The loco's blooming. It's a transformation of consciousness about what beauty is, huh? And it's about diversity and the craziness of nature that we need to come to appreciate. I don't know how we're going to do that, but to me, And then we don't have any herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, gasoline, all that water, all that's gone because the native plants know how to do it. And it's appreciating the beauty of all that. So I would say then, growing, hunting, gathering, and eating plants and animals is so fundamental to who we are and to the experience really of at oneness with endless transformation. It puts us in touch with that. As we eat, the energy and matter in someone, and plants and animals, in my view, are all conscious. They're sentient and they're conscious. When you work with them, you realize, which will in the flicker of a cosmic eye return to earth as plants and animals. And I think in doing that, we can maybe link back and realize we're members of nature's communities. What we do to them, we do to ourselves. Only by nourishing them can we nourish ourselves. So I'd like to turn my attention to two last topics. One is grappling with uncertainty, and the last is fading into mystery. And as I've been saying as I've gone through this, palettes once linked people with the landscapes we inhabited, but nowadays human nutrition seems like to me is incredibly confusing. Back when our ancestors were hunting and gathering, they knew what to eat just as wild creatures know what they need to nourish their bodies, what to eat to self-medicate. Now it's very confusing. Unlike wild domestic animals, people must be told now constantly by authorities what and what not to eat. And if you've been alive for very long, you know that advice changes constantly, right? I'm not trying to criticize nutritionists or that field. It's just there's a whole bunch of reasons. But the advice changes constantly. So with all that advice, you'd think we'd be fit, but actually we're horribly unfit. Like the cartoon says here, well, your weight looks just great. You're just 11 feet too short. So all that guidance has only led to confusion. And there's studies that illustrate that. Here's one that illustrates this point. Vegetarians report a lower desire to eat meat. And I'm not criticizing vegetarians in any sense here. There's a variety of reasons why people are avoiding meat, especially from CAFOs. But vegetarians report a lower desire to eat meat compared with omnivores. But their neural activity, when you measure neural activity, some of the fundamentals that's underlying this, reveals an inherent craving for meat. These findings highlight the dissonance between acquired beliefs and attitudes and the inherent needs of the body. That is to say, this cognitive, rational, analytical mind and all the advice can end up overriding the wisdom of the body. So we stopped listening to the wisdom of our own body, right? We don't. I think for many, wouldn't even have a clue. What is that wisdom, and what is that wisdom telling us, and how do we tune into that wisdom? And we've yielded to advice from authorities without even probably realizing the degree to which that takes place. For the sake of time, I won't, there's so many studies nowadays that show how this advice totally influences. Just quickly one, there's that meat there. They do studies with people where they offer them the same piece of meat, the identical same piece of meat. If they tell them it comes from a factory farm and they ask them here's a piece of meat, it comes from a factory farm, how's it taste? It's kind of greasy, I don't like it very well. This is coming from a place like maybe you folks have, it's wonderful. Do you see what I'm saying? There's so many studies that illustrate how advice can influence what we perceive, how we believe, and how we behave is the bottom line of all this. And we're not even aware. The media folks are so good at doing these kind of things. I'm going to end this piece here on uncertainty with the story of Anita, because I think she illustrates so well how all these kind of things can play out. So she wrote a book titled Dying to Be Me. And she talks about how from the time she was a little girl, she was getting all this conflicting kind of advice, physically and spiritually. She was raised in a very strong Hindu family. She had a Buddhist maid who was talking to her about Buddhism. Then she went to a Catholic or a Christian school who were talking to her about Christian kind of beliefs. And those beliefs are conflicting, right? And so this set up a real, she was told, you're basically going to go to hell. For one way or another, you're not going to make it, kiddo, right? Because you're wherever you are, you're in the wrong belief system. Those things have profound effects on us. These experiences early in life have absolutely profound lifelong experiences. I was talking with a guy last night. He's a good friend, and visiting by phone with him, and he's in therapy. He had a traumatic upbringing, a traumatic childhood. And he's in there with physical therapy. He's 76 years old now, and this physical therapist is saying, the body, just like Claire Sylvia, the body retains memories of all these things, and he's helping to work those out. But it was amazing to visit with him about those. So these kind of experiences influence us in profound ways, and they did Anita as well. So in her 40s, early 40s, she was diagnosed with lymphoma, and she began to study everything she could about holistic ways of healing in Eastern and Western systems. When none of these worked, she decided to go to India and take up this system of Ayurveda, where she was there for 6 months or a year, I can't remember. But by the end of it, she was healed. She was in good shape. All of the symptoms of the lymphoma were gone. But she went back to Hong Kong, and her friends told her, wow, you look great. What'd you do? How did you do that? And she started to explain what she'd done, and they said, there's no way any of that stuff can work. That's hokey kind of stuff. It wasn't a part of their belief system, right? And so all of her doubts started to come back in, and she started to show symptoms again. So then she started to experiment with traditional Chinese medicine, common in Hong Kong, but because of its conflicts with Ayurveda, she felt conflicted. In traditional Chinese medicine, you're encouraged to eat pork, right? That's a fundamentally important part of the diet. In Ayurveda, that's the worst thing. Meat is the worst thing you can eat. You're encouraged to be a vegetarian. So all these kind of conflicting things finally came together to make her not only very ill, but to suffer a near-death experience. She died, basically. And then this book then is recounting what happened during this whole story, but also the near-death experience. And if you've gotten into that and read different people's accounts, her account is very much like that. So in the end, her organ systems failed, and she slipped into a coma. And that's when she really woke up to the whole thing. And what she realized was that it was all the beliefs that she had acquired that were the problem. She said, once I let go of all those beliefs, that was then that healing occurred. When I let go of all these different kinds of belief systems, that the healing occurred. She also said, and this struck me, and I'm going to link back with it. She said, when I was there in the spiritual realm, she said, I had a choice to come back or not. She said, I decided to come back when I realized that heaven is a state, not a place. Heaven is a state, and you can be in it wherever you are. So we identify, and this is natural. It's a natural thing, right? To survive on this planet during our blink of an eye that we're here, we become part of a culture, and we learn certain ways to try to survive in an environment. And so we come to identify with our family, our community, our culture, our religion, our profession, our politics, our country, so on and on and so on and so on. All of what people refer to as this I am, that I am, I'm this, I'm that, I'm something else. But that's a trap. That's a trap, momentarily inflicted in time and space. When we transcend all the this I ams and that I ams, we come to I am, to the I am consciousness. And that gets into what people talk about, people who have had mystical experiences or who have become enlightened. that experience of enlightenment, that felt at oneness with being or God or whatever you want to call it. That's what enlightenment is. It's that felt experience. And I had that experience after cancer, actually, not to go too much, but that you can't put it into words. It's beyond any word that you could say. You just know that you are one with the transcendent, and you know nothing can ever harm you, ever. So every worry goes away. Within that unfathomable peace, there's great joy. Within that great joy, there's love. And that's where you end up. So fading into mystery then, the last part here. So I often think, what will become of Homo sapiens? Will the various trials and challenges that we're facing nowadays awaken us? Will we wake up? That's what the enlightened people talk about all the time. We need to wake up to our at oneness with one another, with everything, with all that is. Will we wake up or not? You know, there's no question we're participating in the sixth mass extinction for the first time in 300,000 years. We likely could be on the brink of extinction ourselves. We're, in a very real sense, seemingly inexorably being consumed by changes we've wrought and consequences that we didn't foresee coming. You know, historically, our tribal nature served us well. When we lived in extended families and clans and tribes, that worked well when there were a few million or even a billion people on this planet. When I was born, there were 2 billion people on this planet. We're pushing 8 billion now. The tribal nature isn't going to work anymore, right? We're one peoples on one teeny little orb. And if we don't figure out how to work together, it could be, I think, the end of us. I often think about what astronauts say when they come back from space, especially some of the ones that first went up, like Rusty Schweikert. It transformed their consciousness. The person that went up, it wasn't the same person that came back down here onto Earth. And Rusty has a short piece that he wrote about that, and I just excerpted here, but he says, when you look down there, you can't imagine how many boundaries and borders you've crossed again and again and again, and you don't even see them. You can't even see them. He said at that wake-up scene, and this predates probably many in here, but the Mideast was battles going, people killing each other like now. You know there are hundreds of people killing each other over some imaginary line that you can't see. Where you see it, the thing is whole, and it's so beautiful. And then his friend Jim Lovell, one of the first people to go to the moon, says from the moon, you realize what you have back there on Earth, a grand oasis in the vastness of space. And he said, it taught me two things. One is how really insignificant that tiny little dot is in the vastness of what? 200, 300 million galaxies, each with billions of stars. How insignificant we really are in the one sense, but then in the other sense, how fortunate we are to be here. You think you die, you go to heaven when you die. You're in heaven right now. We're in heaven right now. At this moment on this planet, the question then isn't if life will continue in this Garden of Eden. The question is whether we as a species want to remain on this planet as part of the Garden of Eden, in my mind. I often think the challenges we face in addressing the, quote, critical issues have little to do in one way with the issues themselves and everything to do with healing the divides that polarize and isolate us from one another. The biggest challenge that's ever been issued to the human race, love your enemies. The irony is working together to transcend the boundaries we create is addressing the really critical issue. And if we did that, we would be able to, in my view, remain here in the garden. But I'm not naive. I often think what Joseph Campbell said. He said, when we talk about settling the world's problems, we're barking up the wrong tree. The world's perfect. It's a mess. It's always been a mess. It's always going to be a mess. You're not going to change that. Our job is to straighten out our own lives. And in my mind, what I try to do, We do that by declaring love, not war, on one another and the landscapes that we inhabit. With that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you one more time.